Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, where I seek truth in the world's best books. I'm your host, Eric Rostad, coming to you from the beautiful Books of Titans studio in Franklin, Tennessee. My goal is to read 52 books per year and share what I'm learning. I'll talk a bit about each book, tie ideas together from a variety of genres, and share the one thing I always hope to remember from each book. Today I'm going to cover 6 different books I've recently read. Those books are the following: Radical Hope, Ethics in the Face of Cultural Devastation by Jonathan Lear, Scotland 2070, Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise by Ian and Dorothy Godden, Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail 1972 by Hunter Thompson, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold by John le Carré, Rising Tiger by Brad Thor, and A History of the World in 6 Glasses by Tom Standage. So I'm just going to cover 2 books per segment of this episode, and I'll cover them in order that I read them. So the first ones I read to the more recent books. In fact, I just finished the last one yesterday, or this morning actually. So I'll start with Radical Hope here. And this book is by Jonathan Lear. The subtitle is Ethics in the Face of Cultural Devastation. And I heard about it. It was a book suggested by Sebastian Younger. And what's happening in this book, it's a nonfiction account of the last of the Crow Nation. So the Native American tribe, the Crow, and is specifically looking at their last chief. And his name was Plenty Coups. So C-O-U-P-S, Plenty Coups. And coups in this case are, they're like achievements, but they're also, it's also what they would call this stick that they would place on, like on a battlefield. And so it was called the coup stick. And what it would do is someone in the Crow tribe would plant this stick, and it told the enemy that this is our boundary. If you pass this, you will die. We are not backing away from this boundary. So it was Jonathan Lear describes it as it was an existential declaration of an impossibility. And it was this establishment of a boundary in the enemy. So the enemy knew, like, this, you were not going to go past here, or you had to die trying. And so Plenty Coups, this meant that this chief had plenty of achievements or things that he was deemed courageous for in his cultural context. But that cultural context was quickly going away with the arrival of the white man and just the decimation of the Crow culture, to where they ended up living on a reservation. And so this book chronicles the life of this man, and it's just a fascinating look at what happens in this scenario. Like how can you move on as a culture where everything that your culture is based upon in terms of the virtues, like the virtue, that was a virtuous thing to be the man that planted that coup stick and set the boundary, and that was a courageous thing. When you're moved to a reservation, that's not courage. There's no way you can do that anymore. So what does that mean for courage? The women in that tribe, they would help the men get ready for these battles. And so a lot of, like, just even preparing food, when you're preparing food for these battles, there was a reasoning behind it. There was a meaning behind it. And so everyone in this culture had this sense of meaning. Their virtues came from that. What was deemed right and what should cause shame, those things were all defined within this cultural context, and it was just stripped away. And so the really neat thing that Jonathan Lear describes in this book is that this last chief, Plenty Coup, has a dream. And in this dream, he kind of sees the future and what they need to do as a culture to get through this upcoming change. And it was so interesting because the author Jonathan Lear would contrast that with other tribes and how they didn't make it and they took a different route. But for the Crow tribe, with their leader, their whole objective was to look at the chickadee bird and to learn from that. And that bird, what it's known for is learning from others. And so in a way, the Crow Nation is having to learn from others. They're having to learn what it means to be courageous outside of their original cultural context. So there's a lot to think about while reading this book. It made me think of the first book on my list this year, which was On Reading Well by Karen Swallow Prior. She goes through a lot of the virtues in that book. And so it was just neat to think about the virtues while you're reading this and how would the virtues live on? Or it even causes you to put yourself in that situation of if the culture that you were a part of, if it was to be completely decimated, maybe by invasion or something like that, what would you do? Like, how would you move on? How would just changes of what it would mean to be courageous for your culture, like how would you move forward with that? And so this book was just a really neat look at that. It's a short book. It's 211 pages. It's 154 pages. And I'm going to highlight this for each of these books as well. The number of pages. I read it between May 23rd and May 25th. So there's like 51 pages per day. It's a short book, but it really packs a punch. And I recommend this one. I really enjoyed it. Next up is Scotland 2070, Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise. And the tagline on this one is an ambitious vision for Scotland's future without the politics. Now, this one was written by Ian and Dorothy Godden, and I know them. My wife and I are friends with their daughter, and the daughter lives in Scotland, and then Ian and Dorothy have written this book about Scotland for 50 years in the future. So what could Scotland look like? Scotland is a country that is near and dear to my heart. I went there the first time when I was 20 years old and have been back many times. I love the country. I love learning about it. I love reading about it. And we just got back from a trip there about a month ago. I love being there. And so it was really interesting to read this book, just to kind of think about what Scotland could be like in 50 years. And it's a small country. It's 5 million people. I used to live in Atlanta, Georgia, and there's more people in Atlanta than there are in the entire country of Scotland. But the authors of this book say that that's an advantage. That means that they can adapt quickly or shift how they're doing things in Scotland quickly. So this book goes through 8 different areas on things that Scotland could focus on. And they are these: looking north, reforestation, renewables, healthcare, financial services, AI, artificial intelligence, digital technology, and maritime industries. So with this one, there was a lot to read through. It's just kind of neat to consider a country from all the different vantage points that this book goes into. But with this one, I just want to highlight one thing that really stuck out to me. And it's something I did not know about before. I'm sure you know about it. I've mentioned it to other people since reading this book, and they're all like, yeah, I know about that. But it was this. There's a northern sea route that goes above Scotland and all the way over to past Russia. And that passage is starting to be navigable because the ice up there is melting. And so ships have started going through there, but you're looking ahead here in the not too distant future, this could become a major trade route, and it would cut a ton of days off instead of having to go south and go around to get to some of these same places. So I just didn't know about this. So this book talks a lot about it because Scotland would be in a very strategic place in that. I mean, they could be a major port in that new trade route. And so whereas Scotland, kind of their entire history has looked south, they've looked to England, they've looked to other markets kind of south. This book is saying, you know what, in the future, Scotland may be looking north, and they may be a major port in this new trade route. The other kind of interesting thing about this trade route is so much of it goes around Russia. And you just think of the geopolitics of the current moment, and it kind of, I guess, put it in a different light as well. Just with Russia's war against Ukraine, how does that fit in with all of this? Because Russia's about to control a huge trade route. What does that mean for what they're doing land-wise here? And then what also does it mean for China? And how close will China need to be with Russia in terms of this? Because China would not have any ports along this route. So how would they get to it? Would they have to have better relations with Russia? It just kind of brings up a lot of questions, but just got me thinking a lot because I hadn't read about it, hadn't learned about it. And now all of a sudden there's this northern sea route that goes from the Pacific to the Atlantic across Russia. And it's something that could really help out Scotland going forward and in a lot of other countries that border that trade route. So that was my main takeaway from that book. I did enjoy just reading the whole thing about, they looked at education, they looked at the airports, they looked at planting trees, they looked at different industries that Scotland could easily get into. And it was just really neat to consider a country. And then they compared it to another of other countries, Norway, Singapore, maybe some other, whether the countries were nearby or of a similar size. And just to say, here's what Scotland could do if such and such. So neat to think through that. That book was 211 pages. I read it between May 26th and May 30th and averaged 42 pages a day. I actually read that book when I was in Scotland, so that was also very fun. I'm going to stop here in this first segment, and then I'll get into the next two books in segment 2. All right, book 3 out of the 6 for this episode was Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, 1972 by Hunter S. Thompson. Now, I didn't know what I was getting into with this book. I had seen it a lot, but I had never heard anything about it, and no one had ever suggested it to me. I was intrigued and thought I'd give it a try. And it was quite the wild ride. Hunter Thompson was the national affairs editor at Rolling Stone. And what this book is a collection of his writing during this time, during the lead up to the presidential election of 1972, which had the incumbent Republican Richard Nixon against a Democratic candidate. And so Hunter is kind of following the different candidates around for the Democratic ticket. And then as it goes into November, so it's narrowing down into George McGovern, and then Thompson is writing about it, but he's at a lot of these events. He's just kind of this crazy guy. He's into drugs. He's into just he's just a wild man. And the type of writing that he established, it's called gonzo journalism. And what happens is he kind of becomes part of the story. And so that's a really interesting aspect of this book. Like he's a character in the book. He's not just saying, George McGovern did this and Wallace did this. And it's like he's part of it. And he inserts himself into the story a lot. And he'll insert himself into the story in the crazy things he's doing and the amount he's drinking and the amount and the drugs he's doing and that sort of thing. But then also just he has these just the most incredible interviews too. I mean, the last section of the book is an interview he has with George McGovern after he has lost to Nixon, and the questions he asks and the stuff he gets out of McGovern in that interview is just astounding. So a lot of really interesting parts of this book. And so I thought I'd just highlight a few things that I learned while reading this book. And the first is this. So George McGovern was the Democratic candidate that finally made it to the end, and then he lost to Nixon. And what was really interesting is that Hunter Thompson, he talks a lot in the book just about journalism and what people expect of journalism. And, you want this person that's kind of outside of everything and doesn't have feelings towards it, but it's just kind of stating the facts. And here you've got a guy, Hunter Thompson, who he became so enamored with George McGovern that it affected his writing in the sense that he totally botched the prediction of how George McGovern would do. And before that, Hunter Thompson was pretty right on with in terms of saying, hey, this is what's going to happen in this election, or this is going to happen with this candidate. But he just got so enamored with the person he was writing about that he kind of lost objectivity there. So that was really interesting. But the first thing I learned was that George McGovern pretty much lost with the voters in what was called the Eagleton Affair. So McGovern had chosen Eagleton as his vice president, and then quickly it came out that Eagleton had some serious mental issues where he was getting like shock therapy and different things, and it just really freaked everybody out to where they didn't want this guy in the ticket. And McGovern was saying, no, I'm going to stick by this guy. He's the right guy. And then all of a sudden he drops him. And so McGovern had kind of stated that he was the non-politician, and then the way that he handled this was in a very political manner. And he just, after that, there was no way that he was going to win. He could not come back from that with the voters. So the Eagleton Affair is what's that called? That's called, and it was interesting to learn about that and just to see McGovern kind of fumbling the response, different people fumbling the response, just really interesting to see that whole thing play out. Another thing I learned is that voters knew about Watergate before the 1972 election and still voted for Nixon overwhelmingly. So I didn't know that. I didn't know that news of Watergate had started trickling out. Hunter Thompson mentions it in a number of the chapters. So that was interesting. Another thing, Wallace, one of the Democratic candidates, was shot. He lived through it, but on the campaign trail, he was shot, and it actually kind of helped him in some ways. But he ended up losing to McGovern along the way. And then the last thing that was really astounding is, and I'll read a few sections here, is that the presidential vote in that year of 1972 was lower than the state level offices. So Hunter Thompson says this in an interview thing. I think it was half the states then had voted for the state level offices, which on average runs about 15% lower than the presidential vote. So, end quote. So I'm taking myself out of the quote here. When people go to vote, usually people voting for the president is 15% higher than people voting in their state elections. But in this election, the presidential vote was lower, was 10 to 15% lower in some states. So what that means is that people going to the polls, they would vote for their state government and the leaders for state government, but they would not even fill out for president. And that usually never happens. Like it's always the other way around. Like more people will vote for the president because it's everyone's been hearing about it for so long and they're going to vote for president. And then, oh, okay, I'll just fill in the state stuff too. This was the other way around. And so people were either so disgusted that they didn't even want to vote, or they just didn't care about it at the point. But that was really an interesting piece of information that was something that I learned in this book. So if you're into politics, this is a great book. It's just a deep look into a campaign, how different people did things. You see different politicians during this time that will remind you of current politicians, and so just to kind of like keep that in mind when you're reading it and see what happened to them. I've really enjoyed that book. Next up was The Spy Who Came In From the Cold by Jean Le Carre. This one was suggested by Graham Greene, an author I read in 2019, and this book was written in the 1960s. So it is kind of one of the main spy thrillers, the classics of spy novels and that sort of thing. And it was so good. It's just funny because it's not like somebody getting killed every few pages or bombs and stuff blowing up and all that. It's more like the intrigue and character development. And then it's just a very rich novel in playing on words. So The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, this whole novel is built around the idea of the main character coming out from under the cold. And that's that's to get out of the spy game, to get to be finally done with that world. But when you're in it, you're in the cold, and then to get out of it, to come out of the cold. And so when you're reading the book, I just started underlining every time the word cold was used, because it was constant, and you're reading it and you're almost feeling cold, because it's just the whole novel takes place in the cold. And so it's not just weather-wise, but it's like a description of the type of world that he's in. And so there's the main character meets a woman. And if there are any scenes where it's somewhat warm, it's in these scenes with the woman. And so even amidst the cold of the life he's living as a spy, there's these scenes of warmth. And the other part of that is this idea of how cold that life is, because there's a lot of discussion about the means versus the ends of being a spy, and what's the ultimate end is to get results. And so the means by which that happens, there could be deaths, there could be betrayal. That's just part of the game. That has to happen because you're trying to get to this ultimate outcome. And here this woman comes into his life and kind of asks him about that. And is that true? Should that be true? And so it's neat to consider that idea throughout the book of just cold. And if he's trying to come out of the cold, what does that look like? What does it mean? And so that was just something fascinating to look at throughout the book. Has a very memorable ending. I will not spoil it for you, but one that you'll be hard to forget, the ending of this book. So I enjoyed this one. It was 253 pages. I read it June 22 and 23, so just over 2 days. I read it quite quickly. I really enjoyed it. Next up, the final two books for this episode. All right, next up, Rising Tiger by Brad Thor. And this was a late addition to my reading list. This is the first book by Brad Thor that I had ever read. And I added it about a day before I read it. And that's because the bookstore where I'm business manager, Landmark Booksellers here in Franklin, Tennessee, we had Brad in, and he signed and personalized books for our customers. And so we had it on our website to where you could pre-order this book, and then you could put a note in, I'd like Brad to sign it this way for a friend or for myself. And so then we had Brad in, and he signed the books, and all of the staff there just got to be with him while he was doing that and talk to him about his books, his life, and all sorts of stuff. So it was really fun. So I picked up this book the day that he was doing that signing at the store, and read it that day, just in preparation. I wanted to be able to talk about the book with him. So I actually got to within 20 pages of the end. And so after the event, I went home and finished the book that same day. But it was really neat to meet him. And what his books are, so it's a thriller, and it's kind of a spy thriller, but it's also more like he's following military and Navy SEALs and ops and that kind of thing that are taking place. But what he's doing is weaving things that you've heard about. So it could be a story that you've heard, like in fact, the novel starts out with a border skirmish between China and India that actually happened a couple of years ago. And then that's the start of this entire novel. And that story kind of weaves its way and connects to different points throughout the book. And then you'll be reading different parts of the book and like, man, I heard something about that. But he just kind of goes into more detail, and he has this character, Scott Horvath, that you follow through all his novels. So Brad writes a book a year, and they're thrillers, but Scott Horvath is this main character that kind of weaves throughout all of these books. I really enjoyed it. I like these kind of books. It's like watching Mission Impossible or a recent James Bond movie, that type of thing. It was fun to contrast it with the book I had read right before this of The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. The Spy Who Came In From the Cold is very 1960-ish, very European spy, where it's very dialogue driven, storyline, character development, that sort of thing. In Rising Tiger, there's character development, but there's a lot of things blowing up, and there's a lot of action and that kind of thing too. So more like that. That more recent James Bond compared to earlier James Bond type thing. Very interesting meeting Brad. I asked him a few questions while he was there. One question that I asked him was there some book that got you started on enjoying spy movies or spy books or that sort of thing? And he said his parents were very big into spy thrillers. And so he had grown up in one of the books he mentioned was The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, that had influenced him in his writing. So it was neat to have read that right before reading Rising Tiger. And then at the end, I was on that kick with the Scotland book that I mentioned at the beginning in this Northern Sea Passage. And I was like, have you heard about this Northern Sea Passage? Because part of the Rising Tiger book talks about the Belt Initiative by China and different initiatives they had with different countries and connecting different countries and that sort of thing. And so I was like, man, have you heard about this Northern Sea Passage that was so cool? I was reading in the Scotland book, and he's like, yeah, my last book was all about that, called Black Ice. I was like, oh, so maybe I need to read that one next to just get into more with that. So yeah, very, very cool. I just like that aspect of kind of current events being tied into a story together, and you're learning along the way, but it's also action-packed and a lot of fun. So that was Rising Tiger by Brad Thor. The last one here that I'll cover in this episode was A History of the World in 6 Glasses. And this is by Tom Standage. This was one where I'd heard about this book from a number of different places. And it was one of those things where I'd heard about it enough from enough different people that it was just like, okay, the planets are aligning and they're telling me to read this book. And that's how I end up choosing a lot of the books that I read, is I just hear the same recommendation from a lot of people. And so this one, as the title would suggest, follows a history of the world in 6 glasses. So there are 6 different drinks that are covered in this book, and then some historical ramifications for each of the drinks. So it's beer, wine, spirits, coffee, tea, and Coca-Cola. So I wanted to highlight a few of these, and then kind of the historical moment that played into that particular drink. So the first one is beer, and that tied into domestication and agriculture and people stopping being hunter and gatherers and settling and planting and that sort of thing. And so beer is tied in closely with bread. So cereal grain would be used to make the beer, and beer ended up being safer than water because you had to boil the water as part of the process to make the beer. And so in a lot of cases, you were better off drinking the beer than you were the water, and it was safer and that sort of thing. So the tie-in that Tom Standage does there is just that beer was kind of there from the beginning with in terms of agriculture. Next up, you have wine, and this kind of became the civilized drink, and it. I want to read a part because it's kind of maintained that over the years. Wine drinking, usually in moderation and with meals, still predominates in the south of Europe, within the former boundaries of the Roman Empire. In the north of Europe, beyond the reach of Roman rule, beer drinking, typically without the accompaniment of food, is more common. And then the world's leading producers of wine are France, Italy, Spain, and the people of Luxembourg, France, and Italy are the leading consumers of wine. And then the countries where most beer is consumed, in contrast, would mostly have been regarded as barbarian territory of the Romans. Germany, Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Czech Republic, Britain, and Ireland, end quote. So just kind of a neat part there where the difference between beer and wine, those lines kind of still exist, to where wine is still the predominant drink in Southern Europe. Beer is more popular in Northern Europe. Next up, you've got spirits. And he tied in the slave trade and rum with spirits. So tied in, like you wouldn't have had some of these things as strong as they were it not for all these pieces working together. So here, just want to read a few parts of this. The connections between spirits, slaves, and sugar were further strengthened following the invention of a powerful new drink made from the waste products of the sugar production process itself. That drink was rum. Then a few pages later, all this was far in the future, however, when rum was first invented. Its immediate significance was as a currency, for it closed the triangle linking spirits, slaves, and sugar. Rum could be used to buy slaves, with which to produce sugar, the leftovers of which could be made into rum to buy more slaves, and so on, and so on. And then the last part of this chapter. Sugar, which originated in Polynesia, had been introduced to Europe by the Arabs, taken to the Americas by Columbus, and cultivated by slaves from Africa. Rum was the liquid embodiment of both the triumph and the oppression of the first era of globalization. End quote. So, yeah, just how he went through different spirits. So, whiskey in the colonies and bourbon and some of the different spirits, but the one he focused on for one chapter there was rum and how that played in with the slave trade and different parts of history. So that was quite interesting. Next up was coffee, and that tied in with the Enlightenment. And then the other thing that was really interesting is that part of why coffee is more popular in the United States than tea has to do with taxes. So here's a section. America now admits coffee free of duty, and the increase in consumption has been enormous, noted the Illustrated London News that year, and the year was 1872. Meanwhile, tea's popularity declined as patterns of immigration shifted and the proportion of immigrants coming from tea-drinking Britain diminished. End quote. So part of it was just, who was coming to the United States, what was their drink of choice from where they were coming from, was it tea or was it not? So that was one aspect of it. But then also in 1872, at least, there was no duty on imports of coffee, and there was for tea. So coffee was cheaper and could be enjoyed by a larger portion of the population. So again, just kind of interesting how one drink might become the drink of the land, whereas it's not that in other countries, which is a nice tie into tea. And tea is the drink of the UK and China and India. And so Tom Standage goes through that history quite a bit, and then also ties in the history of the East India Company and how tea tied into all that. It was really fascinating. The last one is Coca-Cola. So their big thing that is highlighted there is just Coca-Cola's connection with American ideals, Americanism, capitalism, all that, and just the strong connection to marketing as well. So that there's a statement that when something is cheap, when a product is cheap to make, you end up spending a lot of the money on marketing to distinguish your product from someone else's. And so Coca-Cola, you see a lot of early advertising. You see the script that was written. I mean, that's the original script from the late 1800s, and just the terms they would use, the way that they would promote it, a lot to learn about marketing in that. I also wanted to highlight two stories that these are things I learned about Coca-Cola in this book that were quite interesting. So this is during the Soviet Union time, there was a general. His name was Gregory Zhukov, and he was the Soviet Union's greatest military leader. And he had a soft spot for Coca-Cola. But Coca-Cola was the American drink, and you really weren't supposed to drink it during this time. And so Harry Truman worked with Coca-Cola to make a clear version, so a colorless version of Coca-Cola that could be shipped to Zhukov in bottles that had a red Soviet star on it, but it was clear, so it looked like vodka. And they arranged to get this general these drinks, these bottles of Coca-Cola, because he liked it so much. So that was really funny. The other thing that was really interesting that I learned was that Nixon in 1962, after he lost the race for California governor, he joined Pepsi's law firm and became Pepsi's ambassador overseas. And he worked closely with some of the Soviet countries to get not Coke, but to get Pepsi into those countries. And it actually ended up kind of backfiring for Pepsi, because when the Berlin Wall fell and communism fell in the Soviet bloc, Pepsi was kind of viewed as the Soviet drink, or whereas Coca-Cola was viewed as the freedom drink. And so people flocked to Coca-Cola once Coca-Cola could get into that market. But they couldn't get in for a while, but Nixon had helped Pepsi get into the Soviet Union. So just something I didn't know about Nixon, and just some really interesting history. But that's really what this book is about, is looking at history through the lens of these drinks. And it was really, I loved it. And as I was reading it, it made me want to drink each of these things. But I think going forward, anytime I am drinking one of these things, some of these stories are going to come to mind. And just kind of the broader story and how these things fit into history. I love reading books like this. I love reading books that take like a certain vantage point of history and look at it from that lens. And this does that. So a quick book. I read it in 4 days. It's 274 pages. And it was just a really, really fun one to read. So that's going to do it for this episode. I am on book 26. I just started book 26 today, and we are, when this airs, it'll be the 1st of July. So I'll probably have that book finished by then. And I'll be pretty close on track of getting through all 52 books on my reading list this year. To do that, I need to be reading 49 pages per day. And right now I am at, let me look. Actually, I need to read 48 pages per day. And as of right now, I'm at 48. It says I need to read 49 per day to finish. So I'm kind of, within that boundary there. So I'm having a great time with it so far. And of the 26 books I've read, or 25 I've read so far, my favorite is the Apocrypha. I read that earlier this month, and that was a real joy. It was the first time I'd ever read that book and really enjoyed it. So that'll do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear from you if you have read any of the 6 books I've covered, and I'd love to hear maybe something you got out of it that I missed, or something like that. I'll be back in a couple weeks. I'll be talking about another book for my list this year. And until then, keep reading, keep listening, and keep thinking. I'm out.